My name is Caleb. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Second Son Woodworks here on my YouTube channel. And today I'm going to be showing you how I built this bar cart using some old cabinet doors, some 4x4s that I made out of 2x4s, some dowels, some old antique looking wheels, some nice wine bottle and glass racks, and I epoxied some lavender into these doors, which was a pretty cool process. So stick around and show you how I did it. I learned a lot during this project, and if you want to learn even more about what I learned that's not included in this video, check out the more in-depth episodes on this project. I'll leave links below. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I am really happy you decided to drop by. Make sure to check out all of my other videos in my library, and if you like what you see, subscribe. This is a great way to help me out. I usually never say anything about the merchandise available on Threadless with my logo, but I'm going to right now. Hit the link in my About section of this channel to see what cool stuff you can purchase with my logo. Alright, let's get started with the build. Woodworking takes a lot of time and a lot of patience, and if anybody tells you different, then they probably just haven't done any woodworking. This project started off as a simple idea and then quickly became more of a complicated idea. It all started with these cabinet doors and some old 2x4s that I had laying around in my garage. It was a good use of scrap wood, what can I say? But in an effort to be creative and experiment with new designs and materials, I made a bar cart that was really difficult and ended up being a challenging project, one that I learned a whole lot from. So to start off, I took these old 2x4s and cut them down to the length of the 4 different legs that would make the 4 different legs of the bar cart. Now these legs would be stretching the entire height of the bar cart from the top all the way to the bottom, minus the caster wheels, which I will be installing later. Now, since I didn't have scrap 4x4s laying around, I had to use these 2x4s to create 4x4s. 2 plus 2 is 4. Now, since I'll be gluing these 2x4s together to create 4x4s, I needed to clean up one face of each of these 2x4s so that they could then be glued together. And to do that, I used my planer, my benchtop DeWalt planer. This planer and I have been through a lot. We have been friends for nearly 6 years, and I gotta say, I've learned a lot about him. One of the things that I would like to do in the future is update the spinning head where the knives are attached with one of those carbide tip attachments that you can actually rotate the little carbide blades so that you have a much sharper cut. We'll see if I do that at some point. If you've done that before, you should leave a comment below. If you don't have a planer and you'd like to glue up some 2x4s like this, you could still do it. Just try to choose the side that's the smoothest, the flattest, and most likely the best that will glue together. If you do indeed use a benchtop planer like this one, it is a good idea to have some sort of dust collection, because you will be creating a lot of sawdust. If you have never used a benchtop planer like this one before and you decide to purchase one, make sure to read the manual thoroughly and take your time when getting to know the tool. Also make sure that you just take small amounts off of the wood every time you lower it, lower the blade, so that you don't overwhelm the planer. Once the 2x4s had one clean face, I went over to my other workbench and figured out the best pairs to put them together before gluing them up into what would then become 4x4s. 2x4s out of 4x4s. Now, if you haven't already guessed, I will be turning these legs on my lathe to get a nice round look. And so, since I'll be turning them on my lathe, and lathe work is kind of high impact, I wanted to make sure to use quite a bit of glue when gluing these 2x4s together to make 4x4s. I just used Type Bond 2, which is water resistant, but there's a lot of arguments out there about the different Type Bonds. If you want to nerd out, go look at the forums, the comments. People are crazy about glue. I was able to do all 4 of these 4x4 glue ups at once using the clamps that I had on hand, and I just made sure to face the glued part of each of the 2x4s toward each other, so that then there was space in between the non-glued face that wouldn't get glued together, if that makes sense. This saved me a whole heck of a lot of time, and I'm happy that I did it that way. Now, check out this cool oozing glue. It's glue. Wood glue. Once the clamps were fully secured, I let the wood glue dry overnight, and then I pulled out my benchtop joiner to start to clean up the faces of the different 4x4s that I glued up with 2x4s. Now, some may ask, why is this essential if I'm going to be turning these 4x4s down on my lathe? Well, the reason is because before I turn them down on my lathe, I will be drilling some holes for the dowels, as well as making some dado cuts on these different 4x4s. And so in order to make sure that the different holes and dado cuts were perfectly lined up for each of those different 4x4s, meaning the 4 different legs, I needed the 4 different legs to be completely uniform in shape. And so it was important to smooth everything up on the joiner and make sure that each of the 4x4s were exactly the same. Eventually, I'll become a rich woodworker and have a giant joiner that I can join anything, any size, and that will have perfect dust collection. But until that day, this bad boy will do. After that, I then took the now squared up 4x4s made from 2x4s over to my miter saw, my spare miter saw to be exact. This miter saw I picked up at Goodwill in Seattle a number of years ago, and it has been a faithful tool since. So because my lathe was set up over at my other workbench, I had to use this spare saw because the one on my other workbench is blocked by the lathe. This one works pretty well too. So after making sure that all of the different 4x4s were the exact same length, that 2 of the 4x4s were just a bit longer than the other 2. So I needed to shorten those ones, which I then did over on my miter saw, my Goodwill miter saw, once again. And on a more serious note, I keep referring to these 4x4s as 4x4s, but they're not exactly 4x4s. So, be careful how you use that term. After that, I decided to clamp the 4 separate legs together so that I can make a series of marks on one side before making a number of drill holes and dado cuts for the other parts of the bar cart. Now, as I had mentioned earlier on in the video, the process of milling down these glued up 2x4s on my jointer was necessary for this step in the process. I wanted to make sure that I had the exact same cuts and drill holes for the different parts of the bar cart on each of the legs so that everything lined up completely perfect. Now, if I was to not make these 4 separate legs into the exact same size, that would have been difficult. Now you can see here, as I am making these marks across the 4 different legs, I'm making sure to do them across each of the legs so that when I go to make the dado cuts as well as the drill holes, that they would be completely lined up. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, what are these drill holes and dado cuts exactly for? Well, they are for the different levels of the bar cart as well as the railings that will be made out of dowels. Now, in order to get a perfect drill hole, I went ahead and drilled a hole through a scrap piece of 2x4 that could serve as a guide for when I went and drilled the holes into the actual legs, because I didn't want to have to take the pieces over to my drill press. This is a simple way to get a much more square and straight hole when using a hand drill. I should also note that I made sure to tap the holes with a center punch and a hammer before starting to drill into the wood. In addition, I taped on some blue painter's tape onto the drill bit to serve as an indicator of drilling just deep enough into the wood so that I wouldn't drill all the way through. This is a quick little and easy way to prevent yourself from drilling all the way through. You don't want that to happen. After that, it was time to move on to cutting the dados for the 2 separate cabinet doors that would serve as the 2 separate levels of the bar cart itself. Now, if you've never done a dado cut, they're pretty simple. Essentially, it's just cutting out wood that will then serve as an area for another piece of wood to be placed. And in this case, I'm using my circular saw to cut the dado cut, and to do this I'm just doing multiple passes with my circular saw in the area that I need the wood to be cut out, and then I will use a chisel and a hammer to get out all of the excess wood. And if I did the circular saw cuts close enough, the wood should come out pretty easy. This part of the process is extremely satisfying, and the sound that the wood makes as you are cracking it is really nice. And coincidentally, I forgot to turn on the mic when I was filming this part, so I apologize. You will not be able to hear that wonderful sound of the wood chips cracking, but you do get to see it, so enjoy it. Once everything was just a bit cleaned up, I went ahead and tested sliding one of the cabinet doors into the joints, but as you can see, the joints were just a little bit too small, and I don't think I end up extending them, which was a mistake, but I'll solve that later. Now, before moving on to the turning process, I needed to drill additional holes on the sides of the legs that would be perpendicular to the holes that I already drilled, so that I could then have a full railing around the entire square of the bar cart for both levels, which will make a bit more sense later on in the video, but you can see that I had to line them up in my head before making the drill marks and drilling the holes. And once again, I was able to use the scrap piece of 2x4 that I had drilled a hole in as my guide for drilling the additional holes. I really like tricks like this that use scrap pieces of wood to assist in making a more accurate cut or drill. From there, it was time to make marks on each end of each of the legs to prep the blank for being turned on my lathe. In order to do this, you use a square and you mark a line from each corner to its opposing corner, and then you do that for all four corners so that you find the exact center of the piece of wood, and then you're able to drill a hole after punching it, starting it with a little hole punch, and then you drill a hole, which is then where the lathe itself is tightened into the wood to brace the piece between the headstock and the tailstock of the lathe for turning. You can see that the four separate 4x4s that are not really actually 4x4s are completely alike, and the fact that they each have two separate dado cuts that will serve as the space where the cabinet doors will be able to be inserted, and then they each have four separate drilled holes on different faces and at different levels for the different dowels that will serve as the railings for the bar cart. Then at this point, it was ready to mount the blank 4x4 onto the lathe for turning. Now, turning on a lathe can be just a bit overwhelming. There's a lot happening, and there's a lot of different moving parts that have to be adjusted to the correct place in order to effectively be able to spin the wood and then cut it with a knife. If just one little thing is off, the whole process can be impacted. So it is important to fully understand the tool before you get started using it, especially if you're going to be turning bigger pieces of wood that could be dangerous. But I'm not going to lie, that's not how I started on the lathe. Oops. I started by just trying and attempting to make something that looked cool. Over the years, though, I have learned different things to watch out for, common mistakes that happen, and ways to make the whole process just a little bit easier. And if you're interested, check out the other videos that I have posted where I tell you just a bit more about what I have learned while making these legs in particular, but also I have some other videos on how to do other things on the lathe. So if you are intrigued or interested or just simply curious, you should go check those videos out. Give them a watch. It might scratch a particular itch. Like I mentioned earlier, working on a lathe can be a bit intense and it can be pretty messy. Lots of dust is flying all over the place. So in order to take a break, I went over to the old cabinet doors that I had recycled from an old cabinet and prepped them to be refinished. Then it was back to the lathe to begin turning down the second leg, which was better than starting out on the first leg, but not as good as being on the fourth. But so it goes. Now, I'm just going to mention that this music was music that I got off of YouTube that is royalty-free music that I am legally allowed to put onto my videos without getting some sort of copyright infringement case put against me. But I have no idea what this guy is saying. Really like how it sounds though. There is something really satisfying about turning on a lathe. The speed at which the wood is spinning is a bit intimidating, but you get past that, you focus in on slowly shaving off the wood to turn the once square piece of wood into a round piece of wood is really satisfying. But like most things that are good in life, the good things end, or at least they come up against things that are not so good. And that's what happened with this spindle number 2 for the bar cart, and made a bit of a mistake. There is another video that goes into deeper depth when it comes to what happened, so check that out if you're interested. This was really difficult for me. I had spent a lot of time preparing this spindle to be turned and turning the spindle. Felt like a bunch of time had been wasted. And I don't have a lot of time. Time is very valuable. So there was part of me that was considering overall why I was making this bar cart. So I decided to take a break and leave the bar cart project behind and get out of the shop for a while. Go on a little adventure. Needed to clear my head.
Yes, sir.
After returning from my trip, I was fresh, full of energy, and ready to take on the project. So to start off this second part of the bar cart build, I went ahead and worked on sanding down the old cabinet doors that would be used for the two different levels of the bar cart. I wanted to open up the grain of the wood so that the epoxy pour would adhere to the wood, as well as so that the brie wax that I will be using to seal the rest of the wood would penetrate. Some of you might be thinking to yourselves, wow, he's wearing the exact same outfit that he was wearing before he went to Alaska when he broke the spindle. Well, I was. Don't question it. One day after I had completed sanding down the two doors, I laid out some fresh lavender from my garden onto the two separate cabinet doors by accident, and I liked it. So I decided to go ahead and pour some epoxy over top so that it became more permanent. Now at this point I had never epoxied anything fresh like fresh flowers, and I wasn't really sure if it was going to work, but I still decided to go ahead and move forward with my plan. And now I can say safely, after a couple months of using the bar cart, actually 4 or 5 months, the epoxy still looks good, and the flowers that are epoxied into the cabinet door spaces are looking good. I think it worked. Now for this project, I am using Pro Marine's tabletop self-leveling epoxy that I've used a number of times for a number of projects. If you've never used this stuff, it's a good option. That's pretty affordable. You just want to make sure that you thoroughly read the instructions so that you mix the hardener and the resin correctly and for the right amount of time. And then you want to make sure you have some sort of heat gun or torch so that you can pop the air bubbles. For those of you who are also working in a shop that is partly falling apart, as in the floor is cracking and the walls are slowly sagging apart, it's a good idea to have something on hand to level out the piece that you are applying this self-leveling epoxy to, as it will likely not be level to start off with. If you're going to be using a torch to help pop some of the bubbles, make sure not to get the heat or the flame too close to the epoxy, or it might burn it and make it harden and kind of stiffen up, and it doesn't do well. After finishing up the first pour of epoxy onto this fresh lavender, I was pretty satisfied with the results. It was looking nice. I was a little bit worried about the flowers that were popping up out of the epoxy, but we'll figure that out later. After taking a substantial break from turning on the lathe, after going to Alaska for a trip, I was ready to get back to turning on the lathe, and this time around I decided to wear my GoPro for part of it so that I could get a first-person perspective on what it is like to be turning on the lathe. If you're curious about what that looks like, there is a video on my channel. It really isn't the craziest thing to watch, but you will notice that there is a lot of sawdust that is flying everywhere as you're turning and cutting the wood with the wood turning super fast. It makes quite a bit of noise, and that is why I wear a complete face mask, or face shield I should say, when I turn on the lathe. It ensures that things go not right into my eyeballs. And now you can see right here that I am dancing. Yep. So for those of you who have watched from the very beginning of this long DIY video on how to build a bar cart with some old cabinet doors, some epoxy that I did with lavender in it, and then some legs made out of 2x4s that were glued together to become something like a 4x4, and then turned down on my lathe. So if you've been watching this whole video, congratulations. I really appreciate the fact that you have been watching the whole video. And I wish that I could give you some sort of golden or fiscal monetary reward, but I can't. So instead, I just want to say thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. Now, because I broke one of the spindles on my lathe by moving the tool rest into the spinning spindle without turning the machine off, the tool rest snapped the 4x4 spindle, so I had to make another one, which you'll see me doing right now. If you watched the beginning of this video, you watched how I glued two separate 2x4s together to make these 4x4 like legs, and so you'll see me here doing the exact same thing for the leg to replace the leg that I broke. After using quite a bit of glue to clamp together these two separate 2x4s, I went back to doing some turning while the glue was curing overnight, and I gotta say, this part of the lathe turning process where you actually get the corners completely shaved off, and then you get to start to shape the piece, and when the piece itself is a lot smoother, it's a lot easier to work with. I like this part. This part is great. I've said this in other videos before where I am turning on the lathe, but turning on a lathe really reminds me of throwing clay on a ceramics wheel, pottery. Something about centering the piece of wood is very similar to centering a piece of clay. If you've never worked with clay, it's a really great material to work with. I'd recommend trying it out if you never have, but also if you want a similar experience, try out turning on the lathe. Now, I did my best to make sure that the 4 different legs were very similar. If I could, I would have made them exactly similar, exactly alike, but that's kind of a hard thing to do when you're turning on the lathe, and I will say that the 4 legs are not completely the same. They were a bit different, but that's just part of it. So after the 2x4s finished curing with the glue, I went ahead and took them out of the clamps and pulled back out my joiner to essentially shave down the sides of this leg so that it could become the exact same size of the other legs, so that then I could draw lines and marks for drilling the dowel holes as well as the dado cuts for the different levels of the cabinet door. Once that spindle blank was planed down with my joiner, I needed to then make it the same length, and so I cut it over on my miter saw and then brought it back to the workbench, where then I could make some marks for where I would be drilling holes for the dowels, which will serve as the railings for the two different levels of the bar cart. These are just some simple holes that I drilled out. I used a piece of scrap 2x4 to create a drill holes that could be a guide, and then after that I cut the dado joints out for the two different levels of the bar cart that are made from the two different cabinet doors. Pretty simple process, and if you want to know more about this, you can either watch the beginning of this video or check out the other videos that go into more depth about this bar cart to learn how I did this process. Now some somewhat mindless, or at least I should say mindless for you, and not mindless for me, wood turning. Enjoy. At this point, it was time to do the second pour of epoxy, and what I learned after doing the first pour was to not spend too much time moving the flowers around, since when I pour the epoxy it will actually make the flowers shift. So instead I just moved the flowers around after I did the pour using my paint stick. Oof, seeing that grain come alive in the background behind those fresh lavender flowers was so satisfying. Now at this point I would have used my torch to pop the air bubbles on the surface, but when I pulled out my torch it wasn't working right, and so I had to quickly figure out another solution for popping those air bubbles, which I tried a few different things, but finally I ended up using my heat gun, which is kind of like a really powerful hairdryer, and it popped the bubbles. It worked well. Once I moved the flowers into position, leveled out the cabinet door, the epoxy pour was ready to dry. And this usually takes 72 hours or so before you want to start messing with it. As I edged closer to the completion of the bar cart, I needed to pre-drill some holes through the legs where I would be attaching the legs to the sides of the cabinet doors into those little dado cuts that I had cut earlier on in the project. Since I'm using just some scrap 2x4s for these legs, I really didn't want to split them by drilling a screw through them without doing the pre-drilled holes. I ended up just using some basic 2.5-inch long construction screws for this, and I didn't glue anything together because I figured I might want to take it apart if I ever have to move and or ship the piece. And so then after that I did a dry fit and things looked pretty good. I needed to also cut down the different dowels that I'd be using for the railings on each of the levels of the bar cart. These are just some simple dowels that I picked up at the hardware store. Installing the wheels on the bar cart was pretty straightforward. I had to make a couple minor adjustments, but wasn't too hard. I'll leave a link in the description for these wheels below. They're super cool. At this point in the project, it was time to go ahead and start sanding down the 2 separate doors that were filled with epoxy so that I could refinish them, refinish the wood, as well as polish out the different epoxy pours. I have a full separate video on this process if you want to learn just a bit more about how I did this, but here you will see that I started out with a pretty low grit sandpaper to really scuff up the epoxy and sand off some of those flower petals that were left over from the pour that were poking out. And then from there I slowly moved down from a really low sandpaper to a higher bit, and then after I got to a higher bit, I started to use some water to do wet sanding and some more wet sanding paper. And then I actually used a polishing compound, which I'll leave a link in the description for below. But the more that I worked this wood and epoxy, the better it looked. So if you're going to be doing a project like this in the future, just keep working at it. Just keep sanding and washing and blowing off all of the dust, and sanding and washing and blowing off all the dust. It's also very helpful to use some sort of cloth that can absorb some of the dust, such as those microfiber towels that I often use on this channel. Sometimes woodworking is like running a marathon. Near the end of the project, it feels like you're just about done with the project and it's tempting to just start sprinting. And there is a point when you can start sprinting to finish it, but if you do that too early, then you often make mistakes that drag it out. So taking your time is important. Like I said earlier, the more you work the surface of epoxy with different polishing pads as well as polishing compounds, the smoother and nicer it will get. And so just keep on sanding it, or I should say polishing it, because the more you polish it, the shinier and better it will look. The cool thing about a project like this, using old cabinet doors filled with epoxy and fresh lavender, is that you could do this for, say, a wall hang, a piece of art that would be on display for your guests. You don't necessarily have to do this for a bar cart. But as you may have noticed, I am covering the raw exposed wood with some brie wax that I picked up at a local woodworking store in Helena, Montana. Actually a lumber supply store, and they have a couple cool products. Brie wax is awesome. I also use the brie wax to finish the various spindle legs, but before using that brie wax, I mounted them back on the lathe and did some dry and wet sanding, and then rubbed them down with the brie wax to give a nice and simple finish. I could have spent a bit more time finishing these legs with, say, something like polyurethane that would be a little bit more penetrating into the wood, but considering this project had already taken me several months to complete, I was ready to just finish the project. And to be honest, I didn't need those legs to look perfect, since they would just be within my own home, and the natural color of the wood would suffice to make it look nice. And also, this piece of furniture would be indoors, so I didn't need to worry too much about water sealing it. I think I'm really lucky to have the lathe that I have. This old Craftsman lathe that goes up to, I think, 36 inches for a spindle length. I got this from a Craigslist post back in Helena, Montana, and the person that I bought it from had quite a few old tools, and he was quite the tinker, or however you say that, but he liked working on old tools, and he kind of fixed this one up, and it was in really good condition when I got it. I used the same brie wax to rub down the various dowels that I had cut down to the correct length to be used for the railings that would go into those various holes that I drilled into the spindles. After that, I went ahead and attached the nifty gold colored, brass colored wine glass holders and wine bottle holders that I picked up off of Amazon. I'll leave a link in the description below for these. As I mentioned earlier, woodworking can be like sprinting, and this certainly felt like the last lap of a long marathon. Man, was I excited. This project originally birthed from a need for extra space to hold alcohol that was accumulating on my countertop, because not only do I drink alcohol, but my roommates also drink alcohol, and we have a very small kitchen. And so having more space to store our alcohol became very important. And so it was a great use of these old cabinet doors to turn them into a bar cart. They could also store wine bottles and wine glasses and other bottles of booze. And I gotta say, it's been great. It's been really, really, really great to have this extra space to store that alcohol that can make us feel pretty good. Once those wine, glass, and bottle holders were attached to the underside of one of the cabinet doors that would serve as the top shelf of the bar cart, I went ahead and started to put the bar cart together for the last time, or maybe the last time for now, depending on whether or not I sell this piece or move. So if you're interested, check out my website. It might be for sale there, if I don't need it. We'll see. Once the bar cart was together, just about fully together, minus the wheels that I would be attaching here soon, I took a look. And I was pretty satisfied. Not fully satisfied, but pretty satisfied. Well, for those of you who have watched this entire episode of Second Son Woodworks, I gotta say thank you. It's awesome to see the commitment of my followers and the fact that they watch my entire videos. So thank you. And if you like what you saw in this video, you should check out the other videos that I have about this project, and or all of the other projects that are listed in my library on Second Son Woodworks YouTube. Also, I have a TikTok, an Instagram, a Facebook, and I will be launching my website here soon, if it has not already been launched, where I will have various things relating to my woodworking. So check it out. And like I always say, you should get in the shop and you should build something cool, because why not? You only live once, and being creative is damn cool. Cheers.